All right, so in this video, I'm going to cover some of the material in the first book of the Groundwork, which in the version I gave to you is from moving from common sense knowledge to philosophical knowledge about morality. This translation, by the way, this free translation that I'm giving you, has the virtue of being free. It also has the virtue of trying really hard to make the text a little more comprehensible. Those are both good things in translation. Making the material as easy to understand as possible is valuable. It also strays pretty significantly from the original text. So if you ever in your life again read Kant, which will probably happen in a classroom. Most people don't read Kant for fun. But if you ever read him again, you're very likely to come across a very different seeming book, or a book that sounds very different. So this is the best translation here in terms of fidelity, the Cambridge Texts in the History of Philosophy, the Cambridge edition of this. And the first chapter, the first section, is called Transition from Common Rational to Philosophic Moral Cognition. So you can tell that's a little different. I just want to let you be aware of that, make you aware of that, and then we'll move on. So we've seen in the preface that what Kant wants is exceptionless rules. And he thinks that the only way to get exceptionless rules is for those rules to be discovered by reason alone. And it's odd then, a little, that the very first claim he makes is not about what the rules are in chapter 1 or section 1. He says, nothing in the world, or out of it, can possibly be conceived of that could be called good without qualification except a good will. So instead of talking about rules that tell you what you have to do, he's talking about what's good, right? What has value. This is not all that different. In fact, it's exactly the same place that Aristotle starts. Aristotle starts out with a claim about the good. And he spends all of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics on the good. Plato also spends a whole lot of time on the good. So we don't have huge differences here, but we're going to see the differences are going to pile up awfully fast. So he says the only thing that's good without qualification is a good will. And by without qualification here, he means there are no circumstances in which the goodwill isn't good. You might think, well, obviously it's called the goodwill. But what he'll show in just a bit, or what he'll argue for in just a little bit, is that lots of things that are normally thought of to be good all the time aren't actually good all the time in every case. It's also good all on its own. So the point he's going to make, he makes it actually here. Moderation in emotions and passions, self-control, and calm deliberation are not only good in many ways, but even to constitute part of a person's inner worth. And they were indeed unconditionally valued by the ancients. He's talking here about the virtue of temperance, which Plato and Aristotle both talked about quite a bit. Yet they are very far from being good without qualification, good in themselves, good in any circumstances. For without the principle of the goodwill, they can become extremely bad. So a villain's coolness makes him far more dangerous and more straightforwardly abominable to us than he would have otherwise seemed. So he says, like, imagine a person with bad intentions who has temperance. Right? Like, when villainous people are stupid and out of control, that could be bad in its own way, but it makes them, in a sense, weaker and less dangerous. But the villain who has complete self-control, who doesn't get carried away, who has a plan and sticks to it, who doesn't have strong emotional reactions to much of anything, in a way that seems even worse, Kant says, than ordinarily. And the reason why I highlight this passage is he says two things. He says it's very far from being good without qualification, good in themselves, good in any circumstances. Those are two different things. For something to be good in any circumstances just means every time it appears it's good. For it to be good in itself means nothing else makes it good. And so what he's saying about the goodwill is not just that it's always a good thing. What he's saying is nothing else makes it good. It's good in itself. So here he's making a claim, not all that different than Plato and Aristotle, in the sense that he wants to find something that is good on its own, good for in itself, good no matter what. But he locates it in your will, in your ability to make decisions. That's what the will is. Right? It's the faculty that human beings have that allows us to make decisions about what we do. Whereas Plato and Aristotle, well, Aristotle definitely identifies the good as a certain kind of life, right? So that there were certain bad things that could happen to you that could deprive you of the good. If you were a perfectly virtuous person, but something happened to you as bad as what happened to King Priam of Troy, you could have the good life, in a sense, stolen from you. Because if you watch your kingdom fall and your children killed and everything you ever worked for in life undone, Aristotle says, well, you'd have to be like just trying to defend some extreme position in order to say that that person is living a good life. Right? But for Kant, the good isn't a good life, it's a good will. Right? To have a morally good will, that's all that's good, or that is good in itself and good without qualification. And he says nothing else is good in this way. Right? Everything else that has any goodness, and there he does think other things are good, has it not in itself and not all the time, the way that the good will does. And that suggests a picture where the goodwill is what makes everything else good. Right? So being the kind of person who makes the right kinds of decisions, morally, the morally right decisions, that's the best thing in the world. It's the only thing that's good in itself. Everything else depends on something else to be good. And so that a goodwill is the source of all goodness in the world. Right? Nothing else is good except the goodwill or something the goodwill makes good. So the example he uses is moderation with a goodwill is a good thing, right? It's a genuinely good thing. It's separate from a goodwill, apparently. It is good, but it's not good all on its own. It's only good in the presence of a goodwill, and it's only good in some sense because it helps the goodwill carry out its goodness. Right? So this is significant disagreement with Aristotle. Is it a significant disagreement with Plato? Well, Plato thought justice was, in a sense, entirely a matter of what was going on inside your head. Right? Justice was a matter of the rational part of your soul, in a sense, controlling or guiding the other parts of your soul. But he didn't think justice was the only good thing. He just thought justice was always good, and you could never have reason to choose injustice. But to believe that, you don't have to believe that justice is the source of all goodness in the world. Plato doesn't think that. You just have to think justice necessarily goes along with the other forms of goodness in the world, right? There can be other good things that are good all on their own, but justice goes along with it. So he's here disagreeing pretty significantly with both of the great ancient virtue ethicists. He already has been disagreeing with Aristotle along the line. He believes in exceptionless moral rules. He thinks that these moral rules are discovered by reason alone, not by experience. And here he says, really the only thing that's actually all the way good and good all by itself is making or having the kind of decision-making process or the function within you that makes decisions that is good. But he hasn't told us what it is yet. He hasn't told us what the goodwill is. And the argument he goes into, and that's really what actually, by the way, all of chapter 1 is about, is kind of telling us what the goodwill is, giving a characterization of the goodwill, and giving us a characterization of the goodwill that he thinks all of us will agree to. Like he says it's deriving from common sense, or from common rational cognition, in a better translation, the philosophical knowledge about morality. So he's going to take us from common sense ideas about morality all the way to the fundamental exceptionless rules. But the first thing he does is he says, well, go actually to this passage. What makes a good will good? It isn't what it brings about. So here's what you might think. Here's what makes a good will good. A good will is good because it brings about good things. And there is a certain sense that you can make of this, right? When you're making decisions, it seems like you're focused on what you're going to do. Right? So if I want to make a decision about whether to drink a caffeinated soda at 2:19 a.m., I can think about, well, I could drink the soda, which I like, and that's a good thing because I like it, or I could get to bed at a reasonable hour, which is also good. Not in itself, but I don't wake up tired, and I hate being tired, so waking up not tired, that's good. And so I'm focused on the things, right? The things I want to bring about. Decision made. So you might think, well, if when we make decisions, we're focused on what we're going to bring about with those decisions, then you might think, well, here's how you know you made good decisions. You got the good result. Kant's going to say, nope. A will isn't good because of what it brings about. And he says, well, think about someone who tries to do the right thing, but can't succeed. Think about someone who always tries to do their best, but they're just like bad at it. You can imagine someone who always tries to help other people, but maybe they're not smart enough to pull it off, or maybe they're just unlucky, and so they keep failing to help people. But let's say you know that they're actually trying to help people. They're trying to do right by other people. Kant thinks you're going to find that person still equally morally admirable. Now, you're not going to find them as admirable in every way. Obviously, they're not good at helping people. So, like, if you were trying to found a charity, you wouldn't hire that person, right? Because they've shown they're bad at that kind of work. But if someone just asked you, well, is that person a good person? You'd be like, oh yeah, they're a great person. They're just like kind of dumb, right? Or they're just snake bit, right? Nothing goes right for them. You would say they're unlucky. You might say they're not smart. But Kant thinks you would recognize that they're a good person. You would recognize that there's something beautiful and noble about their character. And so, he thinks, the goodwill isn't good because of what it accomplishes. Contrary to what you might think, which is that, well, the only reason we make decisions is to accomplish things. And so the better you accomplish, the better your decisions are. And since will is the faculty of making decisions, the better your will is. Kant says no. Now, Kant is aware that this might seem like a strange idea. And so he tries to explain himself in a way that he thinks will be convincing. And he basically says there's nothing in us that doesn't have a purpose. Everything that human beings have is guided towards some purpose. This is a very common belief prior to Darwin. And even after Darwin, most of us would say there's a purpose to at least most of what's going on with human beings. Although if we were being really precise, we would say, well, there are benefits that come from most of the features human beings have, because otherwise we would have died out and some other better constructed hominid would have replaced us. But prior to Darwin, even people who weren't standardly religious, like Kant was not, thought that, well, everything about the human being is as though it was designed for a purpose. And so he asks, what would be the purpose of a will, of the ability to make decisions? And a will isn't just the ability to make decisions at random. Kant thinks there's a close connection between the will and reason. Right? This is one of the few ways where Kant has something very strongly in common with Plato and Aristotle. It's not like that big a deal, though. Basically, every philosophical ethicist thinks reason has an important role to play in morality. If you didn't think reason had an important role to play in morality, you're probably not going to be looking for a theory of morality. Because, what would be the point? If reason has nothing to do with it, if the way to be a good person is to be irrational, then why would you need a theory, right? That's not going to help you do anything, because a theory is like something the rational part of your mind deals with. Irrational people don't pay attention to theories. Right? So he says, all right, what does it seem like the will is for? And he says, it doesn't seem like it could be for happiness. The will and reason can't be about making us happy. Why? Because instinct would be better at that. And so the will or reason must be for something else. And notice what's weird about this. Right? He's trying to explain what he thinks is an odd idea, or what he thinks most people will believe is an odd idea. That odd idea is that it's expressed back here. What makes a good will good? It isn't what it brings about. And to explain that idea, he goes on to say, well, the will is not well designed to make us happy. And you might recognize that, at least on the surface, it looks like there's a problem here. He's trying to explain why it is that the will isn't good because of what it brings about. And he is actually providing an explanation for why the will isn't good because it produces happiness. Well, what if the thing you're trying to bring about isn't your own happiness? Kant, and this is going to be a strange way, a way you might not suspect if you've read all of Kant, or if you've read some things about Kant, rather. Kant believes human beings are, in one way, naturally selfish. He thinks our desires are all selfish. This sets him apart from Aristotle, even sets him apart from Plato in a way. Because remember, both of them thought there are rational desires. Kant denies that there are rational desires, by the way. He doesn't think desire and reason have much of anything to do with each other. But both Plato and Aristotle thought there were rational desires, and that those rational desires would be desires for things like virtue in itself. Right? So Aristotle goes on and on about this. In order to be a virtuous person, you have to desire virtue for itself. It's the rational part of your soul that does that. And this is the way to sort of incorporate a non-selfish element into what is overall a self-interested theory. Remember, they're both rational eudaimonists. They think everything that you do makes sense only because it gives you a good life. Kant's saying, without being explicit about it here, he's explicit about it elsewhere. But what he's effectively doing in moving from the claim a good will isn't good because what it brings about to the claim that a good will isn't good because it makes you happy, he's implicitly saying that what you're trying to bring about whenever you're trying to make stuff happen in the world is stuff that you desire because it'll make you happy. Right? When you're focused on making things happen, in other words, Kant seems to be suggesting that you're focused on making things happen because they'll make you happy. If you're going to try to accomplish things out in the world, if you're going to try to achieve things, you're doing it to make yourself happy. Or at least that's what's suggested by this move. And it's confirmed later on, I think actually in other works primarily, the Critique of Practical Reason, I think is where Kant makes this a little clearer, that Kant believes the human faculty of desire, which he thinks is a different thing than the faculty of will. He thinks there's like two different parts of the mind, the desiring part and the willing part. And this, again, is very different than Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle recognize different parts to the human soul or mind, but they think there's desire in all of those parts. Desiring is something every part of you does. Kant thinks, no, there's a desiring part of you and there's a rational part of you. What Kant's saying here is the desiring part of you is only directed towards your own happiness. And then he's going on to say, and reason and the will, which are different, would be useless for trying to achieve that. And here again, think about how big a difference this is. Plato and Aristotle's whole theory is wrapped up in the idea that the only way to be truly happy is to live a life of reason. And Kant's saying, well, if you want to be happy, reason's not what you go with instinct, right? What makes you happy is just doing whatever feels right. And what feels right is just instinct. You don't need to be rational to do that. Dogs can be happy, right? Dogs aren't happy because they reason it out. Dogs are happy because they just do whatever they want to, right? If a dog wants to eat some food, just goes over and eats some food. If a dog wants to get its belly rubbed, just drops and turns on its back. So Kant doesn't think reason is necessary for happiness. He thinks instinct is. And you could take this one of two ways. You could take this as a significant disagreement with Plato and Aristotle about what's required for happiness, right? Or how you go about getting happiness. Plato and Aristotle think reason is key. Kant denies it. Or you might begin to suspect that what Plato means by happiness is actually closer to something Plato and Aristotle mean by pleasures, and not just any pleasures, but sort of bestial pleasures. Because it seems like, right, if you're just doing what feels good, if you're just following instinct, then you're just pursuing good feelings. You're pursuing simple pleasure. Now, Plato and Aristotle both believed that the good life was not a life that was just about seeking pleasure. And so you do have to keep in mind here that even though there's similarity of terms, or rather there's similarity of the English terms that a German word and a Greek word got translated into, happiness, they might have very different ideas about what this is. So it seems like what Kant is saying is the will is no good at getting you pleasure. Reason is no good at getting you pleasure. He even says, after a while, those who are after pleasure, realizing that reason doesn't help them out with it, end up hating reason and become haters of reason. They decide, like, oh, being rational is no good. You should be spontaneous and go with your feelings. And Kant does not care for such people. So in this video, I've introduced you a little bit to chapter 1, and I focus mainly on some of the big disagreements between Kant and the ancient authors. Because as we'll see these differences in opinion develop, we will see these differences of opinion develop into significant differences in the overall theory that we end up with.